Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Susan Boyd. She's going to be speaking to us about the developments in heroin-assisted treatment and how substance use affects women. So Dr. Boyd is a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria. She's the author of a number of articles and books, including Mothers and Illicit Drugs, Transcending the Myths, From Witches to Crack Moms, Women, Drug Law and Policy, Hooked, Drug War Films in Britain, Canada, and the US, and Co-Justice, More Harms Than Good, Drug Policy in Canada. And she was a member of the Federal Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation. She also works with the national and community peer-run organizations that advocate for drug policy reform and harm reduction initiatives. Myself, having worked in Vancouver, downtown east side for a number of years, Dr. Susan Boyd's name was a common name in the literature. I just wanted to acknowledge that. And very proud to have and lucky to have Susan here. So thank you and welcome.
Excellent. All right. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Alex and the rest of the organizer and volunteers that have making this event possible. And I wanted to mention that I've been in the Kootenay region a lot. Ever since I was 17, I started coming up, and I've lived here for a number of years, and I would go back to Vancouver and then back up. But when I was a single parent with a young daughter, I had no high school diploma or anything like that, and I was living up here, and really the only job available for me was like working as a waitress at Mr. Mike's and Trail or something. And I mean, I'm not putting that down at all, but I really would like to, I wanted to do something different. And I thought about, well, what do I do well? And I thought, well, besides wanting to have a good time and, I have this child, I love to read. And I thought, well, I'll go to Selkirk College. There's a college, and I'll go there, because certainly if you love to read, you do well at school. Well, it was really quite traumatizing to find out that you need to do more than read well to go to school. There's things like writing papers and, trying to be literate. But it was a fabulous experience for me for my first year of college, and I was always so thankful for the teachers that taught here at Selkirk College, and it looked so different back then. So it's such a pleasure to be back here today. Just a little bit about myself as well, that I've been working around drug issues and drug advocacy for many years, and one of the first groups that I worked with, I guess you could say in sort of a grassroots formal way, was DAMS. It was Drug and Alcohol Meeting Support for Women in the early 1990s, and that was one of the first groups, or the first, as far as I know, where family reunification and meeting women where they were at, a very women-centered program, was developed by myself and two other women, Margaret Mouchard and Olive Phillips. And we didn't have the word harm reduction back then, but what we wanted to provide was a space that women and their children could come together where abstinence wasn't the main focus. If they wanted to attend an abstinent-based program or day program or AA or NNA, everybody was supportive of that. But it wasn't a requirement or criteria of being part of that group or dropping in. And that was a wonderful experience that I had with that group. And then harm reduction became more a household word, and we understood better what we were actually trying to provide in that space. And more recently, I've been working with a group out of Vandu, the Drug User Union in Vancouver, and their name is SNAP, and Dave Murray is the founder and facilitator of this group that's been going on for more than 6 years now. And it's a fabulous group, and I'll refer to it later. But I wanted to say that every person, it's a peer-run group, and they invited me to come help them, or to collaborate with them, not necessarily help, to do their own research and to help them with the communication of their own research. Every single member in SNAP was a research participant in a heroin-assisted treatment clinical trial. And so when the first trial ended and they didn't have a permanent program attached to the clinical trial. Dave Murray, with the help of Van Du and Ann Livingston and others, set up a weekly Saturday meeting, and they've been meeting ever since. And it's quite phenomenal. And what I'll be talking today, I think we wouldn't be at this place without them and other advocates. So I'd like to start off talking about, if I can get this on, let's see. Oh, it's already up there. Okay, what is heroin-assisted treatment? So we've been looking at that for a while. So I'll just say that it's very highly restricted. It's a medicalized opioid maintenance substitution drug treatment. Since the 1990s, we've seen many successful HAT programs in European countries. And it's very restricted in the sense of it's for people where conventional treatments such as methadone maintenance or Suboxone or abstinence-based treatment has failed them. And so with 931 drug overdose deaths in BC in 2016 and a crisis across Canada, heroin-assisted treatment is a well-established strategy that can save lives. Usually HAT is part of an integrated service, so it provides more than just the drug, heroin, the legal drug heroin. These services can provide access to legal services, health services, housing, social supports, and many other services. So it's seen as a continuum of care from abstinence-based services to harm reduction services such as HAT. Usually, heroin-assisted treatment is located in a clinical setting, and people come 2 or 3 times a day to receive their drug, and they're observed before or after. But each program is quite different in the many nations that have them. So HAT is quite an effective treatment, and for all the studies that have been done, and there's been many since the 1990s, we can see that it's safe, it's not that expensive, it decreases the use of illicit street heroin, decreases criminal activity, but what I think is the most important is that it improves people's physical and psychological health. It provides that stability that people need and this access or doors to other services and supports. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I would call the context or the socio-historical background about opiate-based drugs such as heroin, because some of these attitudes that we have about these drugs still exist and they resonate today. And I think it helps us to understand why there's been so many obstacles and barriers to setting up more diverse types of services and treatments for people. Historically, all drugs and medicines were plant-based, such as opium from the opium poppy or cannabis or cocaine, elixirs from the coca plant. And opium-based medicines were used for illnesses and healing for centuries. And so here we have an old 1600 woodcut, and it's the extraction of the sap from the poppy plant, and the sap is what the medicine is. And there is a more contemporary photo on the right side of the sap being extracted from the poppy. In the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, opium-based drugs like laudanum were very popular, and they were used for intestinal ailments, coughs, and of course for pain relief. And they were used by both the poor and the rich. And early on, doctors wrote about the benefits of opiate-based drugs, and white citizens consumed them readily, but when they needed them. We have to remember that at that time, Canada was a rural Canada, and doctors were, few and far between, and so people had to take care of their own, sort of family needs when they were sick. And we also didn't have a publicly funded healthcare system at that time. And so in every household, there would be different medicines that families would have available for them. So there were also soothing syrups that had a bit of opiate-based medicine in them, and those were sold. This is from 1857 for teething children or restless children. People could buy these medicines along with other healing herbs at general stores or through mail order, because a lot of people didn't live near a town or a city center. And then other people had their home medicine chest, which would have rhubarb, stimulants such as ginger and lavender, and opiates. But a change did come about, and we could sort of pinpoint it to 1803, when a German chemist isolated an organic compound from opium. And so every plant, cannabis too, is made up of many compounds. So we know THC is a compound in cannabis, but so is CBD. But there's almost 300 compounds in the cannabis plant. Similarly, opium has a lot of compounds, and morphine is one of those. And in 1803, this chemist was able to extract morphine from opium. And in its refined state, morphine is more potent than raw opium, and it can be taken orally and by injection. From morphine, heroin was then discovered in 1898. And so drugs can be plant-based, like opium or the coca plant or cannabis. They can be refined, like morphine, or they can be semi-synthetic, like heroin is semi-synthetic. Or they can be synthetic, chemical composition, such as methadone or fentanyl, and the many arrays of drugs that we have available to us today. But heroin is a semi-synthetic, and was first derived from the morphine compound in 1898. And Bayer's Pharmaceutical sold that product, and it was sold legally. You didn't need a prescription for it, and it was advertised widely for coughs, pain, intestinal disorders, and other common ailments. And so you could say that this is, in some ways, the beginning of our modern-day pharmaceutical industry, where scientists discovered how to extract a compound from a plant, but later to create these completely synthetic drugs and chemicals that are not plant-based, but sometimes mimic what a plant drug might do. And the industry really took off. But in the late 1950s, Canadians only had available to them about 300 drugs. Today, we have over 10,000 drugs available to us. So it's quite a different society that we live in. And we know that some of those drugs, for good or bad, they're part of our culture. So by the early 1900s, there started to be a little bit of concern about the ingredients in drugs. So it wasn't just about opiate-based drugs, but all patent medicines, elixirs. And so there was rallying by doctors that there should be labeling of those ingredients so people knew better what they were taking. And some physicians wanted to do more than just list the ingredients. They wanted stricter regulation. But meanwhile, this is all going on in British Columbia. We're sort of the center point of drug regulation here, and sometimes the most alternative services as well. White settlers in the 1800s and the early 1900s were actively discriminating against indigenous nations, Chinese and Japanese people, and South Asian people. And white settlers envisioned a white Canada, a white British Columbia. And this led to legal discrimination against First Nations, Chinese people, Japanese, and South Asian. This is the time of the Chinese head tax as well. But this all came back to drug policy in 1907, when there was a labor and anti-Asian riot in 1907 in Vancouver, right around Main and Hastings. And some white workers branched off from the main event, and they went into what was Chinatown and Japanese town, and they started to destroy homes and businesses in that area. And so after the riot settled down, Mackenzie King, who was Minister of Labor at that time, was called in to offer some type of compensation and find out what happened. And when he was in Vancouver, he actually talked to some anti-opium moral reformers, and he learned about their advocacy to ban opium, and it was smoking opium that they were concerned with. Mackenzie King went back to Ottawa, And, it's written in the newspaper. He said, I'll get some good out of that riot. And he recommended that we criminalize smoking form of opium. So it wasn't about the pharmacology of the drug at all. It was because the smoking of opium was associated with Chinese men who were seen as outsiders to the nation, the white nation. So our first narcotic law was enacted in 1908, and then we strengthened it in 1911, and we criminalized possession, but also we criminalized possession of non-medical use of heroin, cocaine, and morphine, as well as smoking forms of opium. So at that time, moral reformers like Emily Murphy, put up here, some of you might know her as one of the women suffragettes, quite famous in Canada for that, but she actually was a moral reformer who wrote a book called The Black Candle that was just filled with racist rhetoric about the yellow people of the world trying to take over, white societies through drug use and black men who use cocaine and would endanger white women. So here we sort of see her, this is from her book, and it pretty well tells the story that she felt would happen. It was this idea that Asian men and black men would corrupt innocent white women and men, lead them into, for women, sexual immorality, addiction, crime. They would abandon their families, and that would lead to the breakdown of the nation. So that's how the thinking went in relation to drugs. They also espoused this idea that the template for middle-class white Protestant respectability was to be sober and to have self-control, so to be self-regulating. Okay, so what does this mean for us? It means that there were race, class, and gender tensions and fears about people who were othered, people who were non-white, corrupting white people in relation to drugs. And so what we adopted in Canada at this time was what we would call primarily a criminal justice approach to drug policy. At that time, the policing and our laws expanded from year to year, and so did their budgets. But we didn't set up any type of public health care or treatment for people who might be having problematic use or wish to abstain or have some support with their drug use. And of course, we didn't have any harm reduction approaches at that time. So what we did was overnight, people became criminals. And the RCMP and many health professionals at that time were adamant that narcotic maintenance was wrong and that it shouldn't be set up, and that abstinence could take place in a jail cell. And so that's what happened for poor and very visible people who used heroin or morphine at that time or opium. And of course, we also had deportation laws for Chinese men who weren't citizens if they were charged with a drug offense. There was also this concept, and it got brought about in the 1920s, called a criminal addict. And what that concept meant, and we referred to it right up until the early 1970s, so I want to be clear about that. It was this idea that people who use these newly criminalized drugs were criminals first, and they were addicts secondly, and I'll use that with hyphens, and that even if we provided treatment for them and became abstinent, they would still be criminals and a threat to society, so why bother? And there was no point in doing heroin-assisted treatment or any other type of opiate-based maintenance treatment because, again, if they received that treatment, they would still be out in society wreaking havoc, because they were criminals. So if you read the literature and the scientific journals and the RCMP reports, there's all of this citing about the criminal addict. And these ideas really do resonate. We've had this strange relationship in drug policy about people being a criminal who use drugs that are criminalized. But I want to say that also we created laws where doctors were not allowed to prescribe opiates for people who are addicted to the drugs. So if they were known addicts, there was a maximum penalty of 5 years, and then that law was strengthened in 1929 to be even stronger. So there's many reasons why health professionals then felt that they were unable to work with people who might be addicted to drugs as well. So in 1958, one of our first methadone maintenance, it wasn't a maintenance, more a detox program, started in Vancouver by the Narcotic Addiction Foundation. And the director of that foundation said that following prohibition in Canada, the criminal law to prohibit these drugs, that the absence of community treatment facilities, publicly paid treatment facilities, must be directly related to this social concept of the addict as a criminal first and a sick person second. I would challenge the sick part, but whatever. You get his point. He was saying it really made it impossible in many ways for us to set up something more feasible for people. And just to be clear, this wasn't going on in other countries. Other countries criminalize these similar drugs for non-medical use. But in the United States, which we often think is the most prohibitionist, country, they actually set up narcotic clinics. There was over 40 clinics from 1912 to 1921 where people were provided free narcotic prescriptions. And in New York City, they had a heroin clinic that also ran for a couple of years. And when reading the history around these clinics, what's so amazing is that they weren't looking for a cure. They wanted to alleviate suffering. And I thought that was just an amazing idea, the alleviation of suffering, instead of seeing people as criminals and we'll just put them in prison. And in the UK, they never lost the right to prescribe heroin for maintenance purposes, and right up into 1968. And following that, they still could provide heroin or morphine for addiction purposes, but they had to be a specialized licensed doctor. And that was very similar to what we had here for methadone doctors as well. It was just a little bit of training and you could do that. And it landed in the hands of some psychiatrists and who are speaking today, I think some of them down in Vancouver as well. In the United States, there was also the narcotic prison farm that was developed and it ran right up into the 70s. And there people could go voluntarily and get treatment, and some people were sent through criminal justice system as well. But in Canada, we didn't have any type of public drug treatment until the 1950s, and that was in 2 prisons. Okay? And it was abstinence-based. And then the 1959 Narcotic Foundation.
Kentucky, or where is it?
Yeah, Kentucky. Yeah, they set up 2 of them, but this is a Kentucky one. Anyway, what we did was we sent people to prison in BC, Ocala Prison Farm, and many people who might be from Doukhobor ancestry, might be well aware of Ocala Prison Farm as well. But many people there were convicted of drug offenses and spent, if you're under 2 years, at Ocala Prison Farm. So what I'd like to say is that at this time, there really was no cannabis use in Canada. It's quite amazing when you look at the drug offense stats from the 1950s, 30s, 40s, whatever. Even 1964, I think we had 11 cannabis arrests. We saw a real change, as you know, in the 1960s, where drug use rates just exploded. And so I want to, sort of entertain the idea that our laws shape policy, but so do social and cultural factors. People who used heroin, illegal heroin, were considered to be criminals and pathological, and the cure for them was abstinence. We had a drug treatment movement in the 1950s in Vancouver asking for heroin-assisted treatment, even that early. A group of people came together saying that drug use is a health issue, not a criminal justice issue. But we saw an amazing shift in the 1960s when white middle-class citizens started to use drugs that were criminalized. And out of that came our Federal Royal Commission, the Ledane Commission, to take a look at substance use in Canada. And so following the Ledane Commission, we saw this expansion of services, publicly funded services. But unfortunately, they weren't that diverse at that time, and there was no effort really that was effective to reform criminal law around our drug laws. And the programs tended to be quite rigid, moralistic, and most were abstinent-based programs. So any of you who are old enough to remember those programs, you know, if you couldn't be abstinent, you were kicked out and you were highly stigmatized at that time, even in the programs that you did manage to stay in. Well, because of our very rigid programs, this led to a public health crisis in the late 1990s in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And people like Anne Livingston, Bud Osborne, and many others brought this crisis to the attention of the health authority at that time and to citizens, in BC, calling for a change in drug policy, for more harm reduction services, for heroin-assisted treatment, for supervised injection sites. There's something more than just abstinent-based treatments that were failing, multitudes of people. And so that's VANDU's. There's many VANDU members that are here today, but I just wanted to give a nod to them because I think it's been the advocacy of groups like this that have brought us to a place where we can even have a language to talk about something different than a punitive drug prohibition policies. So following that, there was the Framework for Action in Vancouver that also talked about having harm reduction. And in the report that came out of that, also they talked about having heroin-assisted treatment and supervised injection sites. But it took all the way till 2003 to have the official injection site set up in Vancouver. Meanwhile, we didn't get heroin-assisted treatment. It wasn't until 2005 that a clinical trial for heroin-assisted treatment opened its doors in Vancouver. That trial, like the many programs around the world, was quite successful in relation to improving the health of the people who participate as research subjects. But unlike any other country in the world, we didn't set up a permanent heroin-assisted treatment program following the clinical trial. That another clinical trial opened up in 2011, and that was a Salome clinical trial. That trial provided heroin-assisted treatment, but also hydromorphone Dilaudid to people. And we don't have all the results from it, but from working with people who are on the trial, it was quite effective for those receiving injectable heroin-assisted treatment and for some who received hydromorphone as well, but not for all. So as the end of the Salome clinical trial was happening, Dave Murray and the SNAP program started to they had been gearing up before that, but really started to ask, forcefully, what will happen to us when we exit this clinical trial? Because part of the criteria to be in the clinical trial was that you had been addicted to opiate-based drugs like heroin for many years and that conventional treatments had failed you. When they exited the Naomi clinical trial, they were sent back to conventional treatments that we knew didn't work for them. So of course, many people started to treat heroin again. Some people were successful transferring back to methadone, but not all. The same thing was going to happen after the Salome clinical trial. And so with SNAP and some legal support from Pivot Legal Society and a couple of the doctors at Crosstown Clinic where the 2 clinical trials had run, the doctors or the physicians submitted what we call special access requests to Health Canada to continue treating their what would be patients now instead of research subjects with heroin-assisted treatment. So if you're not aware, I don't know if they talked about it last night because I wasn't here, but the special access program was set up by Health Canada many years ago to allow physicians to treat patients with serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions with drugs that aren't available yet in Canada. So they have to individually apply for each patient, and it's a very long, lengthy process. But if they're successful, then they can access that drug and have it imported into Canada so that their patient can receive it. So lo and behold, for the first time in Canada, 2013, 21 of these special access requests were successful. So people who were exiting the Salome clinical trial were able to receive heroin-assisted treatment as a patient now through Crosstown Clinic. And they're no longer part of the trial because that was over. On the same day, the conservative federal health minister, Ronna Ambrose, publicly announced that she would stop this special access request for heroin because it was never set up for the purposes of putting illegal drugs into people's arms, but we wanted to tell her it was a legally prescribed drug that they were receiving, and it was a very successful and effective program. Anyways, they did that. By October, they changed the policy, and you could no longer request heroin for heroin-assisted treatment under the conservative government. So right away, some of the SNAP members and the Providence Healthcare Society, which is our BC healthcare provider, filed a constitutional challenge to overturn this federal policy around the special access program. And I'm sorry, this is maybe a little too detailed, but I want us to understand just how difficult it was for people to receive this treatment that was beneficial to them. I don't know if we would ever do this with another drug. Dave Murray likes to talk about, if there was a drug for HIV/AIDS and it was beneficial for people, we would never deny people that drug if the clinical trials proved that it was effective. We would immediately instate that drug into our public health care system. So they launched this challenge, and 4 of the members, plaintiffs on that, were long-term SNAP members, a drug user peer-run group, Dave Murray himself. And they argued that these were unconstitutional, the new policy, and infringed on their charter rights. So since Dave's not here with me or the others, these are the plaintiffs: Larry Love, Deborah Bortush, Charles English, Douglas Lindstrom, and Dave in the suit. And that was at a huge celebration that we had about a year and a half ago. So there was an injunction hearing because people weren't receiving their treatment when the policy changed. So again, people were left to their own devices with conventional treatments that had failed them. So there was an injunction. It went to the BC Supreme Court, and they won the injunction. And so people exiting the Salome clinical trial could once again have their physicians, if they deemed it appropriate, to submit a SAP application for them until the charter challenge was heard, and that was supposed to be October 2016 that we would have heard that case. Well, meanwhile, as you know, there's been a public health emergency, and across Canada and BC, we've had overdose deaths rising, and you could say that the overdose death crisis has been a failure to respond using harm reduction and to change our drug policy as well. The call for heroin-assisted treatment and more supervised injection sites led to activists in Vancouver and elsewhere just setting them up, and the provincial government approving them after the fact. But what happened was that with the election, the federal election, the Liberal-led government decided that they would change that SAP policy, the SAP policy, and they would reinstate the old policy so physicians could once again apply for heroin-assisted treatment, and so the charter challenge was dropped. In some ways that was unfortunate, but anyway, that's what happened. But in April 2017, our federal government announced that there'd be a new regulatory process now to stem the opioid crisis. This is a year after the crisis was even declared, and we knew it was going on for years. But anyway, it's to be used for other public health emergencies and pandemics in Canada, and it would allow the importation of drugs from approved countries, let's say Switzerland, for drugs such as heroin. And public health officers can request the drug and order it in bulk if it's approved from Health Canada. And once it's received, then they can make it available, at clinics and other sites. Okay, so far it's not up and running, but we're hoping the provincial health officers will do the right thing, and this would be available throughout Canada. So working with the SNAP group, they wanted to have interviews done to tell their stories because they felt that oftentimes their story was very different than what they saw in the scientific journals around the clinical trials. And so this is just a quote from a SNAP member talking about why he was very thankful to be in the clinical trial with all of its sort of rigid rules as well. He says, it's time to get more people on the HAT program, especially with everybody ODing. Fentanyl, yeah, that's scary, and I'm thankful I'm not out there taking my chances like that. And so for everybody who's in the clinical trial and everybody following the clinical trial who are able now to have heroin-assisted treatment through the Crosstown Clinic, through the Special Access Program SAP request, they have been protected in a way that their family and friends have not, and if you sit at a VANDU meeting or a SNAP meeting, there's always at the end of it where it's a moment of silence for those people who have passed away or been harmed by the drug war. And there's always call-outs to someone that week who has accidentally overdosed on drugs, and not just opiate-based drugs, but cocaine and methamphetamine, whatever. Another woman said, in talking about her experience with HAT, I didn't want to be walking the streets. I didn't want to be selling stuff. I didn't want to be stealing from my dates, getting hurt because I'm sick and you're hurting. Another woman said when they were no longer able to access HAT when the clinical trial ended, I'm doing street heroin every day now, and I would like to get legal injectable heroin long term. My life was so much better. It was no longer available to her. And another woman expressed just recently, I'm a heroin addict, but I don't like the word junkie. I don't like that because when you think of a junkie, you think of someone who is all passed out and nodding. And she said, though that may happen occasionally, she said, but that's not what I want. I like to use it to function, to get the things done and do what I have to do. And so I think that's a concept that's really missing sometimes in the drug treatment literature, is that when people take a drug, often they feel normal and allows them to have, what someone who possibly doesn't have an addiction or a dependence on a drug might feel that normalcy in their day. But for women especially, and the men that were in the heroin-assisted treatment at Crosstown Clinic, it really offered them a reprieve from our drug laws, the fear of criminalization, and for women, some very gender-specific problems. And so I wanted to say that for women, we've had like a century of policy and research misinformation, really negative print media and film representations of women who use drugs. And we know they're a smaller population than men who use criminalized drugs, but I want to talk a bit about, to this next portion, about how the social control or the regulation of women who use criminalized drugs is very gender specific. And it centers around these things. It centers around reproduction, their capacity to become pregnant, their capacity to be mothers. It centers around continuing double standards of morality, especially around sexual morality. And it's not to say that men don't suffer under drug prohibition, they certainly do. But we have different standards of morality in relation to women and men. Part of this has to do with women's continuing around the world and in Canada, their social and legal subordination. And that we also have gender role expectations for men and women. And for women, the gender norm is that they be good girls, good women, good mothers. And when women transgress these gender roles expectations, they're punished quite severely. And so this is another little chart that talks about this dichotomy that we have, that for women who use drugs, and not so much cannabis, but it's there too actually when you look at the media representations, some of the literature, but that female use is highly sexualized. And for men, we tend to associate their use and selling of drugs as violent male users. And we see this in early depictions. And I know we'll like laugh at this and say, oh, look at that, drug craze, abandon, insanity, degradation, vice. This is what we associated when white women used drugs. And we had similar ideas about cocaine, that if women used cocaine, it would lead them to abandon their family, their homes, their morality, and there would be no coming back. And as I said, that ultimately would be a threat to the nation. But even in more recent years, and this is just one example, not that recent, but Traffic, a US film, and here we see an upper-class white woman who uses crack cocaine and immediately descends into addiction, starts exchanging sex for drugs with a black man who's depicted as a drug dealer. And that was considered to be her total degradation of white womanhood. And you'd think, oh, these just float around sort of in our culture around media and newspaper. But in fact, they really color our ideas about women who use substances. And so, of course, both men and women are really impacted by our laws and our criminal justice system, Canadian Drugs and Substance Act. But where we also do much regulation of people is through drug treatment. And historically, there hasn't been that many gender-specific or culturally appropriate treatment services for women. Also, around the regulation of pregnancy and birth for women. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. And also for women, specifically around social service regulation, this idea that women who use drugs, criminalized drugs, are unfit parents, and child apprehension has been the norm in Canada. And there's been some differences and changes in that in the last 2 decades, but not fast enough. The other issue for women is gendered violence, and that's not just interpersonal violence, but it's state-sanctioned violence, and the missing and murdered women in BC, I think, is just one manifestation of this, but also colonialism, sort of what people refer to as predatory capitalism or neoliberal policies, poverty for women. So one scholar talked about what it was like for women who used substances that were criminalized, and I'm staying with that today. Not talking so much about alcohol or legal drugs, though there is obviously stigmatization that occurs for women who drink alcohol. She said being a woman was one strike against them, being a pregnant woman was the second strike, and being a drug-using woman was the third and final blow in women's social standing. And I would add that women suspected of using criminalized drugs, were not treated equally at all. Being poor is another strike against a woman, and so is being non-white. So we know that Black and Indigenous women are more vulnerable to arrest, they're more vulnerable to child apprehension, and they're more vulnerable to spending time in prison in Canada. And so in many ways, women who use criminalized drugs, their status in society is mirrored in the treatment that they receive in criminal justice, social services, and in the medical spheres. So all of these ideas about women make it really difficult for them to access services then. A lot of the services were very much based on sort of a idea of the male drug user, very much historically abstinence-based. But for women, there is this, they had a lot to lose, especially the loss of their children. And we already know, our previous presenter talked about the residential school and colonization, and that for Indigenous women, it was very difficult to keep the children that they had. And similarly, for women who use criminalized substances, it's very difficult to keep the children that they have because our ideas about drug use equaling poor parenting skills. So these ideas also that women are more deviant than men, are less able to rehabilitate themselves, that they harm the developing fetus, that there's poor mothering, and that they also abandon their home and family still resonate today. And these ideas really came together in the 1980s. It was bad enough. We were punishing women so terribly. But in the 1980s, we had this crack scare, and a lot of the media attention and political attention came from the United States. But in Canada, we were also listening and adopting some of these ideas about crack moms, crack babies, which led to an open letter by leading Canadian US doctors and scientists to say that throughout 20 years of research, none of them research has identified a recognizable condition, syndrome, or disorder that could be termed a crack baby. And by definition, babies cannot be addicted to crack or anything else. But what this led to was much more punitive policies towards women, especially in the United States, where women who use drugs were actually charged under criminal law, and some given life sentences. Children and families were torn apart, and that still continues. There's wonderful advocacy groups working with women in the United States. National Advocates for Pregnant Women is one example. But it's very difficult to know what's going on down there right now with Jeff Sessions as their drug czar. So we'll wish them well. But what goes on in the United States does impact us in Canada, so I want to make that clear, because we watch, U.S. news, some of us obsessively now, but we also watch their films and, the media that comes out of the United States. So what the research has told us about women who use substances: poverty. Poor pregnancy outcomes are shaped by socioeconomic deprivation, poverty, and lack of health care services during pregnancy and following it. Okay. And traditionally, researchers and professionals have been mistaking the effects of poverty with the effects of drugs. Drug use is considered to be a risk, but it's one among many, a manageable one. Women over 35, their pregnancies, they're considered to have a risk factor because they're older than women in their 20s. So it's a risk factor, but one among many that's manageable. And a recent study just came out. They have been publishing since the early 2000s, but they've had a series of publications. They followed infants from birth to adulthood that were exposed prenatally to cocaine. And what they found was that poverty is the more powerful influence on the outcome of inner city children than gestational exposure to cocaine. And we see this with the other drugs as well. It's not to say that there aren't some drugs that, really you would prefer that people don't consume during pregnancy, but I'm talking about these criminalized drugs like heroin and cocaine. So what we found is that when we offer non-judgmental prenatal economic and social supports provided to pregnant women who use illicit drugs, that their birth outcomes improve. And they can have similar pregnancy and birth experiences as women from similar socioeconomic backgrounds if we provide this support for them. And we found in these programs that drug use does not equal poor parenting if you have supports. Now, that's not to say that there's a small percentage of parents who just cannot or unable to parent. That's men and women. But for the majority of parents, what they need is supports. And also in 2003, the first women-centered harm reduction maternity service was opened at BC Women's Hospital. They've had huge successes there working with pregnant women who are using substances. It's an apprehension-free site as well, and there they provide supports for women and supports when they leave the hospital as well. So these, our law enforcement policies really fuel quite a number of drug scares, and we've had one every decade, every half a decade. And with those drug scares usually come more punitive laws. We criminalize more people, but also more punitive policies. And it's hard then to establish what we might call more humane policies in the face of drug prohibition. Because what happens is that it discriminates against poor and racialized women and men and their infants. And it also shapes child protection legislation, and it prevents pregnant women from accessing health care and social supports because they fear that their children will be taken from them. and it prevents us from setting up these diverse programs. And just to bring it into the current context, and I'm going to finish very quickly here. In Ontario, the Ontario government established an independent review a couple of years ago to look at 16,000 hair tests for drugs done between 2005 and 2015 at Mother Risk Drug Testing Laboratory, which is part of the Toronto Hospital for Sick Children. These tests were conducted at the request of Ontario Child Protection Services. And the test results from Mother Risk Lab were used to remove children from custody. So if they found that the parent tested positive for drugs, that would be presented in court as evidence that they were using drugs and unable to parent. The majority of this testing was done on women, and Black and Indigenous women were overrepresented in the testing. There was an investigation. They went through all of the tests that were done. And Justice Lang was at the head of that investigation. And what she wrote in her report was that the hair testing done was flawed. It was unreliable all those years. That the positive hair testing for drugs, including the drug cannabis, was introduced as evidence in these court cases and resulted in many cases temporary permanent loss of child custody. And for some of these children, they were adopted into new families. So the conclusion about this was that there's now what's called a Mother Risk Commission that's been set up by the Ontario provincial government, and they're trying to locate these mothers and, for in some cases fathers, to try to find out if they have custody of their children, if their child was adopted, offer some type of compensation. But they also know, how do you provide compensation if you've been, your family's been torn apart? But this type of testing couldn't have happened if we didn't have these ideas about women. Even on their website, Mother Risk Lab Testing says it tells people in child custody, use our services, because women don't tell the truth when you ask them about their drug use. And so we can provide you with that evidence you need in child custody cases. And not thinking that possibly we provided supports for that family, and that drug testing doesn't tell us anything about parenting. It doesn't tell us how often a person uses drugs. It doesn't tell us whether they're an occasional user, whether they're a problematic user. And it's quite flawed, even so. So in Canada, we've created drug policies that can contribute to the discrimination against women and men and their families. And what we do know is that our experiences and the outcomes of drug use is shaped by our social status in society and the environment that we use. And that people use illicit drugs in Canada are subject to a host of discriminatory, punitive, legal, social, and medical regulation. But that level of control and the impact of that regulation is linked to our social status. So it's linked to our class, whether we're poor, whether we're middle class, whether we're wealthy. It's linked to our race, our ethnicity. It's linked to our gender, our sexuality as well. And so I want to end with just saying that only a small percentage of drug use can be considered problematic. And oftentimes it's situational rather than lifelong. And so social and cultural factors really do shape our drug use. And we know that drug prohibition complicates our drug use in many ways because it's been so punitive and made it difficult to set up programs that would be more non-judgmental and welcoming to people who would like to receive some supports in relation to their substance use. It's made it difficult for us to provide good education, to have diverse programs, to have gender and culturally appropriate harm reduction alternative services as well. So it's never to make light of, I think, the problematic drug use or the suffering that people experience when they are dependent on a drug. But it's to say some of the experience that they have, some of the harmful effects that they have are directly linked to our punitive approaches. And so I'll just end with this idea that some ideas about addiction and the people who use criminalized drugs promote social injustice. Okay? And other ideas promote social injustice. And so I think we're at that moment in history, and we've been there before, but I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that we will end our criminal approaches to substances that are criminalized, and that we'll take a totally different approach right now, not tomorrow, because people's lives are at stake and families have been torn apart for so long, and we need to rectify that. It's a historical injustice that we've contributed to. Thank you.